in the heart of Philadelphia, stands a crumbling stone fortress that looms over the surrounding neighborhood like a sleeping giant waiting to wake up. Its massive 30-foot walls were designed not to keep people out, but to keep the darkest souls of humanity locked within a world of absolute silence. Gargoyles sculpted from cold gray stone stare down from the towers with expressions of eternal torment and serve as a warning to anyone who dares to approach the iron gates. This is Eastern State Penitentiary, and it was once the most famous and expensive prison in the world. But now, it serves as a hollow monument to suffering and despair. The air around the perimeter feels heavy and thick, with an energy that makes passers-by walk a little faster. The silence that once defined this facility was not peaceful, but rather a heavy and suffocating weight that drove hundreds of inmates to the brink of madness and beyond. Architects and philosophers believed that solitude would lead to penitence and spiritual redemption. But instead, it created a breeding ground for psychological horror that stained the very masonry of the building. Every brick and every iron bar in this sprawling complex seems to have absorbed the anguish of the thousands of men and women who wasted away in its damp cells. Locals whisper that the prison was never truly abandoned because the spirits of the condemned are still serving their sentences long after their physical bodies have turned to dust. Visitors who step through the heavy front gates today often report an immediate sensation of being watched by unseen eyes from the shadowy catwalks above. The temperature drops significantly the moment you cross the threshold, and the sounds of the modern city outside fade into an unsettling quiet. It is a place where time seems to have stopped and looped back on itself, forcing the living to confront the terrifying reality of the past. We invite you to journey with us into the dark corridors of America, most feared prison haunt, where the line between the living and the dead is razor thin. This is the story of Eastern State Penitentiary. The history of this imposing structure began in the year 1829, when the concept of incarceration was undergoing a radical and experimental transformation in the United States. The Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons sought to create a true penitentiary where criminals could feel true regret for their sins. Led by influential figures like Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin, the society envisioned a place that looked more like a monastery than a dungeon. They believed that if you removed a criminal from the corrupting influence of other criminals and left them with only a Bible and their own thoughts, they would emerge as reformed citizens. It was a noble idea on paper, but in practice, it became a nightmare. This new method of discipline became known worldwide as the Pennsylvania system, and it stood in stark contrast to the Auburn system of New York, which allowed prisoners to work together in silence during the day at Eastern State Penitentiary isolation was absolute and total for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without exception. Inmates were forbidden from speaking to guards or to each other, and were denied any news from the outside world, including letters from family. The goal was to break the spirit so completely that the inmate would have no choice but to rebuild themselves through prayer and reflection. The result was often a complete fracture of the human mind. The architecture of the prison was designed by John Haviland, and it was revolutionary for its time, featuring a central surveillance hub with cell blocks radiating outward like the spokes of a wagon wheel. This design allowed a single guard standing in the center rotunda to see down all the corridors simultaneously, creating a terrifying sense of constant observation. The layout was intended to resemble a church with vaulted ceilings and skylights that flooded the halls with a divine glow. However, to the men locked inside, the high stone walls and narrow windows felt more like a tomb than a cathedral. The intimidating Gothic facade was built specifically to strike fear into the hearts of citizens. When a new inmate arrived at Eastern State Penitentiary, they were subjected to a ritual designed to strip away their identity and sense of direction. Immediately, they were brought in through the gates and immediately had a heavy hood placed over their head so they could not see the layout of the prison or the faces of other prisoners. This hood remained on until they were locked inside their assigned cell, which would become their entire world for the duration of their sentence. They were referred to only by their inmate number, and their names were erased from daily usage to further dehumanize them. The prisoner ceased to be a man and became a number in a stone ledger. Each cell was a small concrete box equipped with a single skylight known as the Eye of God, which was intended to remind the prisoner that the Almighty was always watching them. The cells had central heating and running water, which were luxuries that even the White House did not have at the time. But these comforts did little to ease the psychological torture. The prisoner sat on a small wooden stool and worked on crafts like shoemaking or weaving while staring at the blank, whitewashed walls. There was no human contact and no voice to comfort them in the dark hours of the night. The Eye of God provided light, but it offered no warmth to the shivering soul below. Communication was strictly forbidden, and guards wore socks over their boots to muffle their footsteps as they patrolled the long, echoing corridors. The only sound an inmate might hear for months was the creaking of the meal cart or the distant clang of an iron door slamming shut. Inmates tapped on pipes and whispered through vents in a desperate attempt to connect with another human being. But getting caught meant severe punishment. The prison was filled with hundreds of men, but it was as silent as a grave, creating a surreal atmosphere that drove many to hallucinations. They became monks in a monastery of pain, worshiping a god of silence that demanded their sanity as a sacrifice. For those who dared to break the rules of silence, the punishments devised by the administration were cruel and unusual, even by the standards of the 19th century. One such device was known as the mad chair, where an inmate would be strapped in so tightly that their circulation was cut off for hours or even days. They were left to sit in their own filth, unable to move a muscle, while their limbs swelled and turned black from the lack of blood flow. In the winter, inmates might be taken out to the yard and subjected to the water bath, where they were doused in freezing water and left to hang on a wall until ice formed on their skin. Another horrific tool of compliance was the iron gag, which was used to silence those who screamed or refused to stop talking to their neighbors. This device was clamped onto the tongue and chained to the wrists behind the back, so that any movement of the arms caused the metal to tear into the mouth. It was a brutal physical manifestation of the philosophy of silence, forcing the inmate to choose between excruciating pain and absolute quiet. Many men died from these tortures, or were left permanently disabled, serving as grim examples to the rest of the population. The warden believed these measures were necessary to maintain the sanctity of the penitentiary experiment. Deep beneath the cell blocks lay the dark and damp punishment cells, often referred to as the hole where no light could penetrate, and the air was stale and fetid. Inmates thrown into these dungeons were given only bread and water, and were left in total darkness for weeks at a time, with rats and roaches crawling over their bodies. It was here, in the pitch-black void, that the mind would finally snap, and the boundary between reality and nightmare would dissolve completely. The screams that echoed up from these depths were ignored by the guards, who viewed them as the weakness of the sinful leaving the body. Today, psychics claim the energy in these underground cells is overwhelmingly negative. In the year 1842, the famous author Charles Dickens visited the United States and made a special trip to Philadelphia, specifically to see Eastern State Penitentiary. The world expected him to praise the modern facility, but instead, he was horrified by what he witnessed inside the stone walls. He wrote that the system was rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement, and he believed it was a cruel and slow torture that tampered with the mysteries of the brain. Dickens argued that burying a man alive in a stone coffin was far worse than any physical beating, because it destroyed the very essence of his humanity. His words were a damning indictment of the system. Despite the criticism, the prison continued to operate, and the mental health of the inmate population deteriorated rapidly, resulting in high rates of suicide and insanity. Official reports often downplayed the number of inmates who lost their minds, but the asylum records told a different and much darker story. Men would smash their heads against the stone walls, just to feel something other than the numbness of isolation, or to escape the voices in their heads. The silence was eventually broken not by reform, but by the sheer volume of madness that could no longer be contained within the cells. The experiment was failing, but the suffering continued for decades. One of the most infamous residents of Eastern State Penitentiary was the notorious gangster Al Capone, who spent 8 months there in the year 1929. Unlike other prisoners, Capone was allowed to furnish his cell with antiques rugs and a radio, and he even listened to waltzes while the other men sat in silence. However, even the comforts of his luxury cell could not protect the crime boss from the psychological toll of the prison or the demons of his past. Guards and inmates reported hearing Capone screaming in his cell at night, begging someone named Jimmy to leave him alone. It seemed the ghosts of his victims had found him. The entity that tormented Al Capone is believed to be the spirit of James Clark, who was one of the victims of the St. Valentine Day massacre orchestrated by Capone. Even a man who ruled the Chicago underworld with an iron fist was reduced to a weeping, terrified wreck by the isolation of Eastern State. Capone survived his stint in prison, but he left with a fractured mind and a fear of the dark that would follow him to his grave. Visitors to his cell today often report smelling expensive cigar smoke or hearing the faint sound of a banjo, which Capone used to play. The energy in his cell remains chaotic and charged. Another legendary figure to grace the halls of the penitentiary was Willie Sutton, who was a bank robber known for his elaborate disguises and multiple prison breaks. Sutton, along with 11 other inmates, orchestrated a daring escape in the year 1945. By digging a tunnel nearly 100 feet long under the prison walls, they managed to flee into the streets of Philadelphia, but were all captured within minutes or hours and returned to their cells. Sutton later remarked that the walls of Eastern State were not just physical barriers, but psychological ones that held you long after you had left. His spirit of rebellion is said to still linger in the damp tunnel remnants. Not all the inmates at the prison were human, as evidenced by the strange and tragic tale of Pep, the cat murdering dog, who was admitted in the year 1924. According to legend, the Black Labrador was sentenced to life in prison by Governor Gifford Pinchot for killing his wife, cherished cat. In reality, Pep was likely a gift to the prison to boost morale. But the story of the dog mugshot and inmate number remains a bizarre chapter in prison history. The fact that a dog was treated as an inmate highlights the surreal and often absurd nature of life inside the penitentiary. Ghost hunters have even reported hearing phantom barking and the clicking of claws on concrete. Over the decades, the strict Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement was slowly abandoned due to overcrowding and the sheer cost of maintaining such a facility. The prison shifted to a congregate system where inmates could mix and work together. But this brought new dangers in the form of gang violence and riots. The cells that were designed for one man were soon stuffed with 2 or 3, creating a pressure cooker of tension and aggression. The silence was replaced by the roar of hundreds of angry men and the clashing of homemade shivs. The holy experiment had transformed into a dangerous warehousing of violent offenders. By the mid-20th century, Eastern State Penitentiary had become a crumbling relic that was falling apart around the inmates and guards who lived and worked there. Riots and fires became common occurrences, and the infrastructure was failing, with sewage pipes leaking and electrical systems shorting out. The state finally ordered the prison to close in the year 1971, and the remaining inmates were transferred to more modern facilities, leaving the stone giant abandoned. For years, the prison sat empty, allowing the forest to grow over the walls and the feral cats to claim the cell blocks. But the stories of what happened inside were not forgotten. For 2 decades, the prison was left to rot, and nature began to reclaim the land, with trees growing through the skylights and vines strangling the guard towers. It became a place of urban legend where teenagers would dare each other to break in and explore the dark, decaying corridors at night. Those who ventured inside reported terrifying encounters with shadow figures and disembodied voices that whispered from the empty cells. The building itself seemed to be alive, breathing, with a malevolent energy that had been festering for over a century. It was during this period of abandonment that the reputation of the prison as a haunted site began to solidify. One of the most credible accounts of paranormal activity came from a locksmith named Gary Johnson, who was helping to restore the site in the early 1990s. He was working alone in Cellblock 4, trying to remove a 140-year-old lock, when he was overcome by a paralyzing force. He described a negative energy so intense that it pinned him against the wall, and he saw black faces swirling in the air around him. Johnson said the faces seemed to be in agony and were trying to communicate with him before the force suddenly released him. He fled the cell block in terror and refused to ever work in that area alone again. Cell block 12 is another area of the prison that is notorious for its high levels of paranormal activity and distinct feeling of being watched. This 3-story wing is known for the echo of footsteps that traverse the metal walkways when no living person is present. Tour guides and visitors frequently report the sensation of someone standing directly behind them, breathing on their neck or touching their hair. The air in this block is often described as electric, and batteries in cameras and flashlights tend to drain instantly upon entering. It is as if the entities here feed on the energy of the living to manifest their presence. In Cellblock, 4 countless witnesses have reported hearing a distinct and chilling cackle that echoes down the long stone hallway. It does not sound like a human laugh, but rather a maniacal and distorted sound that raises the hair on the arms of anyone who hears it. Paranormal investigators believe this may be the residual energy of an inmate who lost his mind in the silence and spent his days laughing at the demons in his head. The sound is often accompanied by the slamming of cell doors, which is impossible since many of the doors are rusted open or welded shut. The laughter serves as a grim reminder of the insanity that permeated the walls. Shadow figures are a common sight throughout the prison, often seen darting between cells or standing motionless at the end of long corridors. One recurring apparition is the silhouette of a guard standing in the central surveillance tower, watching over the rotunda as he did in life. Visitors have snapped photos that appear to show a dark human shape peering out from the guard post, even when the tower is locked and empty. This phantom guard seems to be eternally on duty, ensuring that the inmates remain in their cells and that order is maintained. It is a poignant symbol of the authority that once ruled this space with an iron grip. Paranormal investigations at Eastern State Penitentiary have yielded some of the most compelling evidence of life after death ever recorded on tape. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP captures, are frequent, with investigators recording voices that say things like "get out," or "I am lonely," or "help me." In one famous recording, a disembodied voice clearly answers a question about the conditions of the prison with a string of profanity. These voices suggest that the spirits here are intelligent and aware of the presence of the living, rather than just residual replays of the past. They are trapped in the stone walls, waiting for someone to listen to their stories. Perhaps the most terrifying section of the entire prison is the medical wing, which housed the infirmary, the operating room, and the psychiatric ward. This area was where the sick and the insane were sent, and where many of them took their final breaths in agony and fear. The peeling paint and rusted medical equipment create a scene straight out of a horror movie, and the atmosphere is suffocatingly heavy. Visitors often report feeling sudden waves of nausea or dizziness as soon as they step into the hospital corridor. It is here that the line between medical treatment and torture was often blurred, leaving a dark stain on the location. Inside the medical wing stands a solitary dentist chair that has become one of the most photographed and feared objects in the entire penitentiary. It sits alone in a crumbling room, illuminated by a shaft of light, and many claim to see the ghost of a surgeon standing beside it. Some have reported seeing the chair move on its own, or hearing the high-pitched whine of a drill when the room is silent. The pain and fear experienced by inmates in this chair seem to have imprinted on the object itself, creating a focal point for paranormal activity. It is a throne of suffering that commands respect and fear from all who see it. Physical interaction with the spirits is rare, but it does happen particularly to those who show disrespect or provoke the entities within the walls. There are numerous reports of visitors being scratched, pushed, or having their clothes tugged by unseen hands while walking through the darker sections. Some have left the prison with unexplained bruises or red welts on their bodies that fade hours later. These physical attacks suggest that some of the spirits are not just passive observers, but angry and aggressive forces capable of causing harm. It serves as a warning that the entities here are not to be trifled with. Theories abound as to why Eastern State Penitentiary is so haunted, but the stone tape theory is the most popular explanation among investigators. This theory suggests that the emotional intensity of events can be recorded into the environment, particularly in stone and water, acting like a magnetic tape. The extreme isolation, torture, and madness experienced by the inmates generated massive amounts of emotional energy that was absorbed by the limestone walls. Under the right conditions, this energy is replayed, allowing visitors to witness the echoes of the past. The prison is essentially a giant recording device of human misery, playing on an eternal loop. Today, Eastern State Penitentiary operates as a museum and historic site. But for several weeks each year, it transforms into a massive haunted attraction known as Terror Behind the Walls. Actors in grotesque makeup jump out at thrill seekers, but many of the staff admit that the real scares come from the building itself. Actors have reported being tapped on the shoulder by invisible hands, or seeing figures standing in the shadows that are not part of the show. The blending of fake horror with real paranormal activity creates a chaotic energy that seems to feed the spirits. It is a dangerous game of inviting fear into a place that was built on it. Skeptics often dismiss the stories of ghosts as the result of overactive imaginations or the power of suggestion in a creepy environment. However, even the most hardened non-believers often have trouble explaining the sheer volume of consistent reports from people who have never met. The heavy atmosphere of the prison is undeniable, and it affects everyone who walks through the gates, regardless of their beliefs. There is a weight to the air that presses down on the chest, a physical manifestation of the history that surrounds you. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, you cannot deny that something lingers in these halls. Restoration efforts are ongoing to stabilize the ruins and prevent the prison from collapsing entirely. But the goal is preserved decay rather than renovation. The administration wants to keep the prison looking as it did when it was abandoned, maintaining the eerie aesthetic that makes it so unique. Conservators work carefully to shore up walls and fix roofs, while trying not to disturb the resident spirits or the atmosphere. It is a delicate balance between saving the structure and respecting the energy that resides within it. The ruin itself is the artifact, and it tells the story better than any polished museum exhibit could. As you walk through the Cellblocks today, you can listen to an audio tour narrated by former inmates and guards who lived and worked at Eastern State. Their voices guide you through the wreckage, sharing stories of riot's despair and the daily grind of prison life. Hearing their real voices while standing in their empty cells creates a powerful connection across time that is both moving and unsettling. It reminds us that these were real men with real lives who were subjected to a failed social experiment. The ghosts are not just spooky stories, they are the echoes of a tragedy that we must remember. The tour guides who work at the penitentiary day in and day out often have their own stories of strange occurrences that they only share in hushed tones. They speak of keys going missing and reappearing in locked rooms, or of lights turning on and off by themselves in the middle of the night. The psychological weight of working in such a depressing and haunted environment takes a toll, and many staff members refuse to go into certain areas alone. They treat the building with a deep respect, knowing that they are guests in a house that belongs to the dead. To them, the haunting is simply a fact of their daily workplace. Eastern State Penitentiary stands as a testament to the failure of the idea that total isolation can cure the human soul of its sins. Instead of penitence, it produced madness. And instead of rehabilitation, it produced broken men who could never function in society again. The prison is a physical scar on the landscape of Philadelphia, a reminder of a time when cruelty was disguised as benevolence. The spirits that haunt these halls are the victims of that hubris trapped forever in the place that destroyed them. They are a warning from history that we must never forget. As night falls over the Fairmount neighborhood, the stone walls of the prison seem to grow taller, and the shadows lengthen to swallow the grounds. The gargoyles on the towers are silhouetted against the moon, watching the city with their stone eyes. Inside the gates, the silence returns, reclaiming the corridors from the tourists and the noise of the day. This is the time when the prison truly comes alive, when the past bleeds into the present. It is not a place you want to be when the sun goes down. The philosophy of the Pennsylvania system has long been discredited, but the energy it created remains locked within the 30-foot walls. The suffering of the inmates who wore the hoods and sat in the silence has stained the earth and the stone indelibly. No amount of renovation or tourism can scrub away the psychic residue of a century and a half of misery. The prison is a vessel for the dark side of the human experience, holding it tight so it does not spill out into the world. It is a dam holding back a river of sorrow. So if you ever find yourself in Philadelphia and you decide to visit this crumbling monument to the past, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. Listen closely to the silence, and you might hear the faint tapping of a prisoner on a pipe, or the shuffle of feet on the gangway. And if you feel a cold breath on your neck, or the sensation of being watched, do not turn around. Just keep walking towards the exit and be grateful that you can leave. Because for the souls trapped in the masonry, there is no release date. Eastern State Penitentiary remains America's most feared prison haunt, not because of jump scares or monsters, but because of the very real human horror that took place there. It is a place where the eye of God watched men go mad and did nothing to stop it. The tragedy is woven into the architecture, and the ghosts are simply the memory of that pain, refusing to fade away. As you step back out into the free world, take a moment to look back at the looming walls. You might just see a shadow looking back at you, waiting for the day the silence returns forever.